The evening he canceled my sister's wedding invitation on my behalf, he told me he was protecting our family's reputation. I smiled, thanked him, and began, that same night, the quiet work of ending him. My name is Adiz. His name was Gareth. And by the time the story is finished, you will understand exactly why I kept a folder of receipts in a shoebox labeled winter boots at the back of a closet he never once opened. I should say, before anything else, that Gareth was not a man who raised his voice. He did not need to. Men like Gareth learn early that volume is for people who have not yet learned how to be believed quietly. He spoke softly, reasonably, always with the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slightly slower than himself. It took me the better part of 5 years to understand that this tone was not patience. It was control wearing the mask of patience, and it is a much harder thing to fight than a raised fist, because no one else in the room ever believes you when you try to describe it. We had been married 7 years. In the beginning, Gareth managed things the way some men manage things when they mistake competence for love. He handled our finances because he was better with numbers. He screened my friendships because he was protective. He decided, gradually, without ever announcing a single rule out loud, which family gatherings I would attend and which I would regretfully decline, always with an excuse he had already written for me before I even opened my mouth. The wedding invitation was my younger sister's. Her name was Ngozi, and she was marrying a man Gareth had decided, based on a single dinner 3 years earlier, was not serious enough for our family. When the invitation arrived, addressed to both of us, Gareth read it at the kitchen table, set it down, and told me he had already sent our regrets on my behalf, citing a work conflict that did not exist. He said it the way you might mention you'd already picked up milk on the way home. A small errand, handled, nothing worth discussing further. I did not argue. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty matters more in this story than anger does. I nodded. I said something forgettable about understanding. And then I went upstairs, sat on the edge of our bed, and made a decision that would take me the next 16 months to fully carry out. I decided that I would attend my sister's wedding and every gathering after it, and that Gareth would simply never again be given the chance to decide otherwise, because he would no longer know enough about my life to interfere with it. The closet in our guest room became my quiet headquarters. It was full of old coats and boxes of decorations Gareth had no interest in, the kind of space a controlling man overlooks precisely because it looks like clutter rather than concealment. At the back, behind a box labeled Christmas, fragile, I kept a second shoebox labeled, in my own handwriting, Winter Boots. Inside were the beginnings of a life Gareth did not know I was building. The first item in that box was a prepaid debit card, purchased with cash at a drugstore across town, reloaded every few weeks with small amounts of money I set aside from grocery budgets Gareth reviewed line by line, but never quite closely enough to notice the difference between what a week of groceries actually cost and what I told him it cost. It was not much at first. $20 here, $30 there. But patience, I had already begun to understand, compounds in ways that anger never does. The second item was a notebook, not digital, because digital things can be searched and synced and discovered by a man who occasionally, for our security, asked to see my phone. In that notebook, in a shorthand only I could read, I began recording things Gareth said and did that I knew. Even then, no one outside our marriage would believe if I simply described them from memory months later. The canceled invitations. The unexplained withdrawals from accounts he controlled. The night he told my mother over the phone that I was resting, when in fact I had been sitting 3 feet away, silenced by a look he had given me before he picked up. I called my sister Ngozi for the first time about the wedding 6 weeks after Gareth sent our false regrets, using a phone I had bought at a pawn shop with cash, kept charged only in short bursts, hidden inside a boot in the winter boots box that I had, with some private amusement, made almost literally true. Ngozi cried on the phone when she understood what had actually happened, that I had wanted to come, that the excuse had never come for me at all. She asked me, gently, how long this had been happening. I told her longer than I wanted to admit, and that I was finally ready to stop pretending otherwise, at least to myself. Gareth worked as a senior claims adjuster at an insurance company called Fenwick Mutual, a mid-sized regional firm known, ironically, for advertising itself around the idea of protecting families when it matters most. He had worked there for 13 years and had built, in that time, a reputation as meticulous, thorough, a man who caught details other adjusters missed. His supervisor, and the person he answered to most directly, was a woman named Marguerite Solis, 59 years old, a claims director who had built her department's credibility over 2 decades on a foundation of exhaustive, honest review. I had met Marguerite twice at company holiday parties, both times briefly, both times with Gareth's hand resting at the small of my back in the particular way that looked, to anyone watching, like affection and felt, to me, like a leash disguised as a gesture. Marguerite had been kind both times, telling me once that Gareth was the most careful adjuster on my team, the one I trust to catch what everyone else misses. I remember smiling and saying something polite because at the time I had no reason to think that trust was built on anything other than what it appeared to be. That changed in the 8th month of my quiet preparation. On an afternoon, Gareth had forgotten to log out of his work email on our shared home computer, something he almost never did, being a man who guarded his devices as carefully as he guarded everything else. A folder caught my eye only because of how carefully it had been misnamed, labeled simply Archive 2019, tucked several folders deep inside a directory that otherwise made obvious, logical sense. Inside were claim files, dozens of them, spanning several years, each one flagged internally as denied for insufficient documentation or suspected exaggeration, the kind of language adjusters use to reject a payout. But attached to several of these denied claims were separate documents, drafts of a different kind, files showing that portions of those same denied claims had, in fact, been quietly approved and processed through a secondary account, routed to a small claims processing contractor named Foster Renwick Associates, a company that did not appear anywhere in Fenwick Mutual's approved vendor directory. The pattern, once I understood what I was looking at, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Gareth was denying legitimate claims from ordinary policyholders, people who had lost homes to fires or cars to floods, recording those denials in the official system to keep his numbers looking appropriately strict and cost-conscious for the company. Then, quietly, he was approving a fraction of the payout anyway, routed through Foster Renwick, who processed the funds and returned a portion back to an account I did not recognize but would later learn belonged, in part, to Gareth himself. I did not touch the computer further that day. I closed the folder, restored the screen to where it had been, and went about the rest of my afternoon as though nothing had shifted, though something fundamental had. I understood, with a clarity that frightened me a little, that the man controlling every detail of my private life had also spent years quietly stealing from people who had already lost everything once, and were counting on companies like Fenwick Mutual not to make them lose it twice. Over the following 10 weeks, I did the slow, careful work of documenting what I had found, using the prepaid phone hidden in the boot to photograph screens during brief windows when Gareth left himself logged in, never taking more than a handful of photographs in any single session, always careful to leave no trace of extended access that might alert a man who prided himself on noticing details. I sent nothing forward yet. I simply gathered, patiently, the way you gather evidence you already suspect will matter far beyond your own marriage. During this period, Gareth's control over the smaller details of my life did not loosen. If anything, it tightened the way I now understand it often does in men like him, some instinct sensing a shift even when no specific detail has yet been discovered. He began asking, again, to review our joint bank statements together each week, a ritual he had abandoned years earlier and now revived without explanation, sitting beside me at the kitchen table, running his finger down each line as though daring me to have hidden something from him. I made certain, every week, that there was nothing there for him to find, because everything that mattered was already elsewhere, in a shoebox, behind a box of Christmas decorations, in a life he did not know existed. The night I finally understood the full scope of it, I was not looking at Gareth's computer at all. I was looking through an old filing cabinet in our garage that Gareth had asked me to sort through for a home office renovation, files from years before he worked at Fenwick Mutual, when he had briefly held a similar position at a smaller, since closed insurance brokerage. Inside one folder, beneath old tax returns, were early emails between Gareth and a man named Foster Renwick himself, dated years before Gareth ever set foot inside Fenwick Mutual's offices. The scheme, I understood with a slow, sinking certainty, was not new. Gareth had built this exact arrangement once before, at a different company, and had simply carried it with him, refined and quieter, into a job that trusted him completely. I called Ngozi that night from the boot phone, standing in the garage with the door pulled shut, Gareth asleep upstairs, unaware that his wife was standing 20 feet away holding proof of a decade of quiet theft. She was silent for a long moment after I explained it, and then she said the words that finally pushed me from patient observation into deliberate motion. She said, "Adiz, this isn't just about you leaving him quietly anymore. Real people lost their homes and got told there wasn't enough money to help them. You have to do something with this." The next week, Ngozi connected me with a woman named Delphine Achebe, a forensic claims investigator who had once helped a friend of hers uncover a similar scheme at another insurance company years earlier. I called Delphine from a payphone outside a laundromat, paying with coins I had saved specifically for calls like this one. She listened to my description of the denied claims, the shadow approvals, the mysterious contractor, without interrupting for nearly half an hour, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone who understood immediately how serious it was. She told me two things I have carried with me since. The first was that what I was describing sounded like organized insurance fraud combined with a kickback scheme, the kind of case that draws attention not just from a single company's legal department, but potentially from state insurance regulators and possibly federal investigators, given the scale and duration involved. The second thing she said more quietly, the way Odalise and Priya and every careful professional in stories like mine seemed to say it. She said, "Adiz, once this moves forward, you will not be able to call it back. This will end more than your marriage."
Are you certain this is what you want?
I told her I had been certain for the better part of a year, and that I had simply been waiting until I had enough proof that no one could dismiss it as a bitter wife's imagination. Over the following 2 months, working carefully through brief windows of access and the hidden phone, I sent Delphine everything: the photographed denial records, the shadow approval documents, the old emails establishing Gareth's history with Foster Renwick predating his employment at Fenwick Mutual entirely. Delphine compiled it into a preliminary investigative summary, methodical and precise, the kind of document designed to be taken seriously by people who had every institutional incentive not to want it to be true. While Delphine worked, I made 2 additional preparations of my own. The first was a consultation with a family attorney named Bianca Okafor, recommended by Ngozi's own network, who specialized in cases involving what she called financial coercive control, patterns of restricting a partner's access to money and independent life as a form of ongoing abuse, a term that described my marriage with a precision that unsettled me the first time I heard it applied to my own life rather than someone else's. Bianca began quietly preparing documentation for an emergency financial protective filing, one that could freeze certain joint accounts and establish, on paper, the years of restricted access I had lived under. The second preparation was smaller, more personal. I began, item by item, moving what remained of my own independent belongings, a small collection of my late father's woodworking tools, jewelry from my grandmother, a handful of books Gareth had always dismissed as clutter he'd have to work around, into a storage unit I rented under a slight variation of my name, paid for entirely in cash, accumulated one careful withdrawal at a time from the prepaid card in my winter boots box.
I was not fleeing.
By then, I understood the distinction clearly. I was simply arriving, slowly, at a life that no longer required his permission to exist. The final piece arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday, when Gareth mentioned over dinner, with obvious pride, that Fenwick Mutual was expanding his region to include 2 additional counties, meaning a larger volume of claims would now pass through his desk each month. He said it the way men like him say things they assume no one else in the room is equipped to fully understand the implications of. I refilled his water glass and said nothing, because I understood immediately what that expansion actually meant: a wider pipeline for the same quiet theft, more policyholders who would be told there wasn't enough money to rebuild their lives while a fraction of what they were owed vanished into an account with Gareth's name quietly attached to it. That same week, Delphine finished her preliminary report. Bianca filed the emergency financial protective request the following morning, submitting Delphine's findings simultaneously to a state insurance fraud division and to Fenwick Mutual's outside compliance counsel, ensuring the information could not simply be absorbed and buried by anyone inside the company still loyal to Gareth. I made one final call myself, to Marguerite Solis's office directly, using my full name for the first time in over a year, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding what I described only as a serious matter involving claims integrity. Her assistant, a woman named Petra, asked for more detail. I said it was personal and it could not wait, and something in my voice must have carried weight, because she found me an opening the very next afternoon. I dressed with unusual care that morning, a deep green blazer purchased with money that had, quite literally, come from winter boots that were never actually winter boots at all, hair pulled back, no jewelry except a small ring that had belonged to my grandmother, one of the last items still in that storage unit rather than sold. I did not attempt to hide the exhaustion in my own face, the particular tiredness of a woman who has spent over a year being vigilant every single day, because I understood, somehow, that this too was evidence, even if no one else in that office would recognize it as such. Fenwick Mutual's regional office occupied 3 floors of an unremarkable office park on the edge of the city, nothing like the marble lobbies I had half expected for a company that had, according to Delphine's estimate, quietly diverted somewhere close to $600,000 over roughly a decade. Marguerite's office was orderly, lined with framed commendations and photographs from company charity events, the visual signature of a woman who had built her career on being scrupulously fair. She stood when I entered, shook my hand firmly, and gestured to a chair, her expression carrying the polite, slightly guarded curiosity of someone unsure why an employee's wife had requested an urgent private meeting. I placed a sealed folder on her desk and slid it toward her without preamble. Inside was the summary Delphine and Bianca had prepared together, the denied claims alongside their shadow approvals, the emails establishing the scheme's origin years before Gareth's employment at Fenwick Mutual, and a cover letter noting that copies had already been submitted to the State Insurance Fraud Division and to Outside Compliance Counsel that same morning. Marguerite opened the folder slowly. She read the first page, then the second, and I watched her expression shift through the same sequence I have come to recognize in every person who discovers, all at once, that someone they trusted completely has been quietly betraying the very thing they built their career protecting. Confusion first, then a dawning, sickened comprehension as she began to understand not just what Gareth had done, but how many people, real people who had lost real homes, had been told there simply wasn't enough money to help them. She looked up at me once, about halfway through, her hand pressed flat against the desk as though steadying herself. I did not look away. I simply let her keep reading. When she finished, she closed the folder carefully, both hands flat against it, the particular stillness of someone absorbing a betrayal that would follow her professionally for years to come, regardless of how correctly she handled what happened next. She asked, quietly, whether I had known how long this had been going on. I told her the truth, that I had only understood the full picture in the last year, though I suspected it had been happening far longer than either of us yet knew. She thanked me, her voice steadier than I expected, and told me the company would cooperate fully with any investigation. I stood, thanked her for her time, and told her the regulatory filing had already gone out that morning, timed deliberately so that no one inside the company would have the chance to quietly manage the problem before it could be properly examined by people with no loyalty to Gareth at all. Outside the building, I sat in my car in the parking lot for several minutes before starting the engine, not to collect myself, because I had done that work slowly over the better part of a year and had nothing left to gather in that moment, but because I wanted to remember precisely how it felt. The folder leaving my hands, the particular quality of silence in a room where a woman who had built her entire reputation on fairness understood, all at once, exactly how badly she had been deceived. By someone she trusted. Gareth called at 2 o'clock. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more within the hour, each time closer together, the rhythm of a man beginning to sense, without yet understanding the specifics, that something fundamental had shifted beneath him without his permission. At 3:30, he sent a text. It said only, "What's going on?" Not quite the same words as other men in other stories, but carrying the same undertone of a man who already suspected the answer and dreaded confirming it. I did not respond. I drove instead to the storage unit, sat for a while beside the boxes holding what remained of my life before Gareth. My grandmother's ring still in its small velvet box, my father's woodworking tools wrapped carefully in cloth, and allowed myself, for the first time in over a year, to simply breathe without calculating my next move. Then I drove home, because Bianca had advised maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy until the protective filing was formally processed, and because I wanted one final ordinary evening in that house as a woman who understood exactly what was coming, while Gareth still did not. He came home late that night, unusually subdued, and did not mention the folder or the calls or the text. He asked whether I wanted to order dinner, his voice carrying the careful, softened tone he used whenever some instinct told him his control over a situation was slipping and needed to be gently recaptured rather than forced. I told him I had already eaten. I went to bed early. He sat alone in the kitchen for a long time before he came upstairs. The financial protective order was formally granted 3 days later, freezing the joint accounts Gareth had always controlled and, more significantly, the secondary account Delphine had traced back to the Foster-Renwick arrangement. Fenwick Mutual placed Gareth on administrative leave within the week, once their own internal compliance review confirmed the pattern Delphine had already documented independently. He was terminated a month later, once the scale of the fraud, ultimately estimated at closer to $700,000 once investigators traced the full history back through his previous employer, became impossible for the company to characterize as an isolated mistake. I did not attend the criminal proceedings that eventually followed, though Ngozi did, several times, and reported back to me each time in a tone that had shifted, over the months, from anger on my behalf to something quieter and more settled. Gareth accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, agreeing to restitution obligations that would follow him for years and a sentence that included both probation and a period of incarceration far shorter than the harm he had caused, though by then I had stopped measuring justice by the length of anyone's sentence and started measuring it, instead, by the simple fact that it had finally, after so long, become visible to someone other than me. My mother-in-law, a woman named Beatrice who had never once, in 7 years, asked me a single question about my own life beyond how well I was managing Gareth's, called me once, weeks after he moved out of the house. She asked whether I had known, before it became public, what her son had actually been doing. I told her the truth, that I had known enough, eventually, to understand it needed to stop, and that I regretted it had taken this particular shape to get there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice stripped of the polite distance she had always maintained with me, she said she was sorry for years of assuming that whatever difficulties existed in our marriage were mine to manage rather than his to answer for. We have not spoken since, but I think of that call sometimes, the strange, late arrival of an apology that changes nothing and still, somehow, matters. I moved, eventually, into a small house 2 towns from the one Gareth and I had shared, close enough to keep my job at the community library where I had worked quietly for years, in the background of a marriage that had left very little room for anything of my own. Ngozi helped me move the last of my boxes on a bright afternoon in early autumn, and when we finished, we sat on the floor of my new living room, the shoebox that had once been labeled winter boots open between us, empty now except for a single pair of actual boots I had bought, almost as a private joke to myself, the week after Gareth moved out. I think often about the woman I was the night Gareth calmly told me he had already declined my sister's wedding invitation on my behalf, and about how long it took me to understand that the softness of his voice had never once meant safety. I did not destroy Gareth. I want to be precise about that, the way precision has become important to me since. Gareth destroyed the trust of policyholders who had already lost everything once and believed, wrongly, that a company built on the language of protection would actually protect them. I simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of what he had already done, one photograph, one document, one quiet phone call at a time, in a house he believed he understood completely, in a life he never once thought to look at closely enough to see what I was quietly building behind him. The most dangerous thing a man like Gareth can do is assume that a woman who has stopped arguing has also stopped thinking. I had 16 months of thinking running beneath my silence, and by the time he understood that, the story had already been finished, filed, and delivered in an office lined with commendations for fairness by a woman he had once quietly decided did not need to attend her own sister's wedding.